what you think these next few weeks could look like for Bryan Harsin? I realize he's got football games to get ready for, and nobody has fired him yet, but it certainly seems inevitable, does it not?
It does, Paul. It feels like more of a when, not an if at this point. And that's something that I think a lot of us saw the writing on the wall even before the season started. We've talked plenty on your show in the past about, the well-publicized coup attempt that was essentially made around last February to get this guy fired. It didn't work. He came back. But, I think even you and I probably talked about at the time that it was going to be extremely difficult for him to succeed under the circumstances that were in place. And we're starting to see that play out. Obviously that loss to Penn State was a brutal one. It was embarrassing. That's pretty much as bad of a showing as they could have had, especially in front of all these high-level recruits that were in the building that Bryan Harsin badly needs to convince to come to Auburn, given where they stand right now in the recruiting rankings. And so it's a treacherous path ahead for Bryan Harsin. You can. I guess, if you're him, you got to just try to keep plowing ahead. You got to start getting some wins. You got to start doing better on the recruiting trail. That's your path forward at this point. But that feels pretty challenging at best, given where things stand right now. And the fact that, as we've talked about, some very important people wanted him fired last year, and they still want him fired now.
Yeah, one last thing on that. If you lay all your cards on the table on a recruiting weekend and it goes flat, and forget flat. I mean, it was a disaster. It's hard to imagine turning that around. So the boys in the back room, those who you know well, who you've written about before, and I realize they're not talking publicly, but what do you think they are saying privately?
I think they're thinking about who the next guy is going to be. I think they're thinking about how much is everybody going to have to contribute to make this problem go away. I think that's, I think that those wheels are in some ways already in motion, and I think they've been in motion for a while. I mean, you could argue that the day he was hired, against the wishes of some of those people, the wheels were in motion for him to inevitably get fired. I mean, he's been fighting such an uphill battle from day one because he was not the preferred choice of these people. And, and I think it's already led to Alan Green being gone. We've talked about that in the past too. He very publicly bucked the wishes of these people, hired Bryan Harsin, with no ties to the South, with no ties to the SEC. And it has played out, I think, pretty predictably poorly. And that I think he is, by all accounts, a pretty good coach. I think by all accounts, he's a pretty good guy, but not the right fit at Auburn, probably from day one, and certainly isn't right now. And so now you're kind of just looking to see when does this end and who might be the guy to come in after Bryan Harsin.
John, I remember back in February, the hot name for a day or two or three was Hugh Freeze. We all know his past. But you suggested today Lane Kiffin, and I've had a lot of friends ask me, do you really think Lane Kiffin would take that job? So I ask you, since you wrote it, give us your best read on Lane Kiffin.
Well, I think both of those two guys, to your point, Paul, are the ones that have been mentioned, will be mentioned the most. And there's a reason why. Some of these big boosters like those two guys. So what I'll start with is this. The last time there was a coaching search which ended in Bryan Harsin, both Hugh Freeze and Lane Kiffin were essentially non-starters. Hugh Freeze absolutely was not going to get hired at that time. And Lane Kiffin, was interested in that job. I think some people around him expressed interest to Auburn about his, interest, but it didn't go anywhere. Obviously, he didn't get the job. Was not seriously considered at that time. So that's some of the basis for me, is knowing that there was interest last time. Things have changed. Auburn is in a worse position than it was 2+ years ago. Lane Kiffin is in a better position than he was 2 years ago, and so that changes the situation to some extent. But I think him and Freeze and some of the other guys, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point, those are some of the obvious names that make sense. That if you're Auburn, if you're making a change, to start with those guys, because I think what we've seen at Auburn is a bend back into what they know. We saw it with the presidential hire, the guy being promoted internally. We'll see what they do AD-wise, but I think most people believe it's going to be someone who understands that world, has some ties to Auburn. And I think with their head coaching hire, it has to be someone who understands the SEC, who understands the South, who understands what it takes to get it done in the SEC. And guys like Kiffin and Freeze are two of them. But as I've noted, they both come with well-publicized baggage, and that will be part of the equation that Auburn has to figure out whether they're okay with accepting that baggage.
John, I understand why Hugh Freeze would leave Liberty. He's got a really good program, but they're beating some ACC teams. They came up a 2-point conversion short the other night, but they're really a good program. But Lane Kiffin's not only with a good program right now. They could be a great program. We all know what happened last year. They look equally good this year, even with a different quarterback. So explain Lane Kiffin and what would compel him. This is a guy that turned down Arkansas a couple of years ago. What would compel him to leave Ole Miss for Auburn? And I know you'll cite precedent with Tommy Tuberville doing the same thing, but this is many years later.
Yeah, and I don't want I already have had enough Ole Miss fans yelling at me for writing this column, so I don't want to get even more of them upset about me making this comparison. But look at the track record of Auburn. Look at what they're capable of achieving. They won a national championship 12 years ago. They were in a national championship game a few years after than that. We know that is a program that can recruit at extremely high level. They have a lot of resources. There are some very rich benefactors who pour money into the program. I mean, there's just a lot of the advantages that you would want with a program are available at Auburn. Now, of course, the big gorilla in the room is that you're in the same state as Alabama, and that is something that they will always be compared to by their fans, by their boosters. But I think Lane Kiffin is someone who is uniquely qualified to be able to handle that situation. I mean, could you not imagine Lane Kiffin being in the same state as Nick Saban and just poking that bear over and over again? I think he would handle that situation very well in a way that Bryan Harsin has not. I think Bryan Harsin has not been able to rise to the occasion and the standards that have been established in the state of Alabama. So here's the thing. If you're Lane Kiffin, and to be clear, I have not said that Lane Kiffin will take this job. My argument is that he should be the top guy that Auburn calls when they inevitably make a hire here. But I think if you're Lane Kiffin, what you really have to wonder is what other jobs can you get? I mentioned there is some well-publicized baggage there. There are guys who are afraid to hire someone like Lane Kiffin.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.